Okay, I think we're going to get started. So welcome to this event hosted by the University of Sheffield. What place does grammar have in our schools? Just ahead of his talk, Michael Rosen would just like you to have a look at this, at the paper that I've put in the slide here. He's not going to talk directly to it, but it's something to consider. Welcome. My name's Chris Montgomery. I'm a senior lecturer in dialectology at the University of Sheffield, the School of English, who's hosting this event. I'm going to chair the event today, but you won't hear too much from me because instead we're going to hear from our speakers. So we'll hear from Professor Emma Moore, Professor Debra Myhill, and Professor Michael Rosen. We also have some organisers that we'd like to thank. So Dr. Julia Snell, Dr. Sarah Spencer, and Dr. Ian Cushing. And they're here in the panel as well. So just to let you know what the schedule's going to be, you're hearing the introduction now, as you probably will have guessed, and that'll last for another minute or two. And then we'll have our talks, which is, of course, what you're here for. The talks will be around about 20 minutes. Some people have slides, some people don't. And we'll have a 5-minute break in between each talk, just to allow people to get up, stretch their legs, and do what they need to do. We'll have a 5-minute break after the talks as well, a chance for people to gather their thoughts, and then we'll move into a Q&A session. I'll let you know how to ask questions in just a moment, and we'll finish up with a summary of the event and evaluation. Just a few housekeeping notes. As I've said, the talks are going to be around about 20 minutes. There'll be that short time to switch between presenters. I think Emma's got slides and Deborah and Michael don't. I'll do a short introduction for each talk, so each person you're going to hear from, just so you can find out a little bit more about them. In terms of questions, we're going to use a tool called Padlet to manage the questions. I'm putting a link in the chat for you now. You should also access that, or you can scan the QR code and access it on phones or tablets. Using Padlet, you should just be able to double click on the canvas and add your question there, or click on the Add Content button down on the bottom right-hand corner, and you can add a question there. The reason we're going to do Padlet to ask questions is so that you can ask questions over the course of the talks without using the chat, because sometimes that can be a bit distracting for the presenters. So you can add questions to the Padlet canvas. And what we're going to do as the talks go on is we're going to group those questions into themes, and then we'll use those themes for the Q&A part of the event. If someone asks a question that you are going to ask, then don't feel the need to type it out yourself. There's a thumbs up button just below each post on the Padlet canvas, and you can just click the thumbs up button to upvote that question, and so that we can attend to questions that have been asked by the most number of people in the Q&A. So we're having some sense of the most popular questions. If you've got a question for a specific person, just pop their name at the start of the question, and then we can make sure it's directed to the right person. We've got a hashtag, and that's grammar and me. I'll put that into the chat for you now. So if you want to live tweet the event, feel free using the hashtag grammar and me. If you've got any technical difficulties, put those into the chat. We'll do our best to deal with them. And this event is being recorded, so you'll have a chance to watch it again. If you would like to, we'll email a link to the recording as well as an evaluation form for the event when the event's finished, so after 6. Okay, so that's my introduction done, you'll be pleased to know, and we'll move on to our talks. So our first speaker is Emma Moore. She's Professor of Social Linguistics at the University of Sheffield and has just completed a British Academy Mid-Career Fellowship, which was focused on understanding how grammar helps to communicate social information about speakers. She is continuing to work on grammar, but now shifting her focus to understand how primary school children use grammar and how this relates to what we might want to teach them about grammar at school. and she's going to talk about what grammar means to me.
Sorry, everyone. I got my slideshow up and then I couldn't unmute myself. I was being too clever by getting the slideshow up in too keen a fashion. Okay. I'm going to start by just talking a little bit about some of the issues that I think are pertinent today. And basically, if you've spent any time on social media recently, then you're going to know that there's been quite heated debate on the subject of grammar teaching in primary schools. And this debate has gained prominence in the public eye, largely because of homeschooling during the pandemic. So what that's allowed parents to do is to have an insight into the kind of grammar teaching that children are receiving. And in some senses, the fronted adverbial has become the kind of poster child for current grammar teaching policy. But this cartoon of the grotesque fronted adverbial bird that was drawn by Chris Riddell, sorry, I just decided this is a bird. I don't know if he wants to refer to it as a bird. This was drawn by Chris Riddell in 2016. So you can see that this isn't actually really a new debate. Now, the most militant in the grammar debate have argued that we shouldn't be teaching grammar at all, and in fact that children don't need to know any grammatical terminology. Others have taken issue with the focus on terminology at the expense of creativity. So Michael Rosen, who you'll be hearing from later, has suggested that a focus on terminology has led to a writing by numbers approach to grammar. Our other speaker today, Debra Myhill, has argued that it remains important for children to learn about grammar, but that prescribing when and where certain grammatical structures appear reduces creativity and actually doesn't even really help them to be knowledgeable about grammar either. So I'm going to be talking about why I think grammar is important, and I'm going to try to demonstrate how children use it creatively all of the time. So for me, grammar is a social and communicative resource, and that's how it should feature in our education system. But first, let me be clear on what I mean by grammar. So for me, grammar is the way in which we construct or structure our language, both in terms of the verbal utterances, so the kind of things that I'm doing now, but also in terms of our written text, so what you're seeing on the screen. It refers to the way we put strings of words into interpretable units or clauses. So if we take this sentence, the fronted adverbial bird eats creativity, there are certain rules in English about where the nouns, the verbs, and other parts of speech can appear in this sentence to make it coherent. And following these rules helps us to understand each other. Grammar also refers to the way in which we combine meaningful units of language or morphemes into words. So in the word eats in our sentence, we can see that this is made up of the verb eat and a third person present tense marker s, which tells us that the eating is taking place in current time. Now, grammar is helpful because it allows us to distinguish between systematic language use and genuine language error. But systematic language use doesn't necessarily mean just using one variety of language. So the use of non-standard or local dialect features is also subject to systematic rules, just as other types of language are. So to explain what I mean, I'm going to start with a non-linguistic example. So during lockdown, my 5-year-old was learning to measure length. So she started out using a non-standard unit of measurement, a building block. So we discovered that her slipper was 5 building blocks long. The next week, we moved on to using a standard measurement, the centimetre, and we discovered that her slipper was 12 centimetres long. Now, both of these types of measurement worked and both were systematic. She had to follow rules to use them. So the blocks were all the same size, just as the centimetres were. The blocks had to be placed next to each other without spaces, just like the centimetres are in a ruler. So the standardised measurement, the centimetre, is obviously used universally, but the blocks work equally well to compare different lengths. Now, we could have used something else to measure her slipper. We could have, for instance, used her a collection of plastic rings, of which she has many. But all of her plastic rings are different sizes, so they don't follow the same structural rules. So for this reason, they would have been a disordered unit of measurement. They're not systematic or easily interpretable. Now we can convert this example to a linguistic example. So my daughter also doesn't like wearing socks, and she could express this in several different ways, including by saying, I don't like any of these socks. She might also say, I don't like none of them socks. Now, both of these expressions are structured following rules of English. It's just that one of them follows the rules of standard English and the other follows the rules of non-standard English. And both are perfectly grammatical according to the systems in which they're found, and in terms of how they produce negation or express something like a determiner in standard English or non-standard English. But if she'd said something like, "me no like this sock," this would have been a speech error. It's not constructed following the rules of any variety of British English. So language is grammatical if it follows systematic rules. And this is as true for non-standard English as it is for standard English. It's simply not the case that anything goes in how people use non-standard English. So grammar is helpful because it allows us to distinguish systematic language use from genuine language errors. And this can be helpful in identifying developmental language disorders or language delay. So for instance, speech and language therapists are generally not looking for an inability to use standard English. They're looking for an absence of systematicity in any variety of English. Although, of course, the extent to which ideologies about non-standard language interact with language testing is not well understood. And that's something that my colleague, Sarah Spencer, one of our organisers, could talk about at much more length than I could. And I encourage you to look at her work on this topic. So the problem with grammar is that lots of policy demands use of standard English in contexts where it's not strictly necessary. It also presents grammar as inflexible and rigid. So there are rules about how utterances in text are structured, as I've shown, but these rules are then overlaid with another set of rules which unnecessarily prescribe the context in which certain structures are used. So grammar's theoretical, and that is to say linguists have theories about how language is structured. It's not factual, but that's the way that education policy, and to be fair, some linguists can suggest that grammar operates. So grammar's only good if there are, the idea of it being rigid propagates ideas that grammar's only good if there are X number of fronted adverbials or Y number of noun phrases in a sentence. Now, to show the flexibility of grammar, I'm going to give you an example about personal pronouns. So personal pronouns, as I'm sure you all know, vary according to case and number. So they can be used as the subject of a sentence, as shown in blue, in the table in blue, or they can be used as the object of a sentence as shown in the orange table. And they differ according to the person and gender of the referent. So if we were to replace the noun phrases in a sentence like Lara gave the socks to Mum, where both Lara and Mum identify as female, we'd replace them with the subject noun phrase, Lara with the third person singular feminine pronoun she, and the object noun phrase Mum with the third person object pronoun her. Now, you don't need to worry about all of that terminology. The important point here is that there are systematic ways in which pronouns operate, and we actually tend to learn this quite automatically. But acquisition pronouns is developmental, and children can benefit from being taught about them, especially if they have a developmental language disorder. So how might we teach about pronouns as a feature of the grammar? Now, I've alluded to the fact that there are two main ways to think about grammar. We can think about it as a rule book, or we can think about it as something flexible, so something more akin to a toolkit. So another of our organisers, Ian Cushing, has researched how we can use these kind of metaphors in educational discourse. And again, I'd direct you to his work if you want to know more about this. Now, if we take the rule book approach to grammar, then we might teach the following rules about pronouns. So they're used to replace a noun. They refer to a person or a thing, and they're used to avoid repetition, making communication clearer. Now, I've seen all three of these cited in worksheets targeted at primary school children. Now, there's nothing much to dispute about the first two assertions. They're relatively unproblematic. We know that people use pronouns in the places of nouns, and they obviously refer to people and things. But what about this third one? So the idea that they're used to avoid repetition. Now, I'd like to suggest that this is potentially one of those rules which has been overlaid on another set of rules in order to unnecessarily prescribe the context in which pronouns are used. So to determine whether pronouns are systematically used to avoid repetition, I'm going to give you some examples from everyday talk. So if we imagine somebody asking the question, have you seen that fronted adverbial bird? Now that might elicit the following responses. We might get something like, yeah, that fronted adverbial bird's weird, as in the first one. Or we might just get, yeah, she's weird, as in the second one. Now, if we go back to those rules, the pronoun in the second one replaces the noun phrase in the original question and refers to a thing. So we might argue that it avoids repetition, but it's less easy to argue that it makes communication clearer. In fact, if someone had uttered one in response to the question rather than two, we might notice there's a slightly different emphasis being placed on the significance of the bird. So compare, have you seen that fronted adverbial bird? Yeah, that fronted adverbial bird's weird. Compare that with, have you seen that fronted adverbial bird? Yeah, she's weird. Okay, so when you're comparing those two forms, it becomes apparent that using the pronoun is not directly correlated with clarity and might be doing other things in the interactional frame as well. But notwithstanding these problems about correlating repetition and clarity, what's going on with these two examples? So you could potentially get a response like, yeah, she's weird, that fronted adverbial bird, or even, yeah, she's weird, her. Now, these two are grammatical constructions known as right dislocation. Again, the terminology is not really important, but essentially what they're constructions where you've got some repetition of pronoun and the noun phrase. But note what's important here is that the pronoun comes first in these constructions. Okay. Now, they're very common in everyday speech, although some types of right dislocation are more common than others. If we were to do a quick poll, so you'll just have to do this for yourself in your head, you might ask yourself which of these are okay for you. So could you say both 1 and 2? Could you use 1 but not 2? Or could you not use either? Now, if we'd done this poll in real time, what I would expect to see is that some people do avoid using these types of constructions altogether, or they're certainly not willing to admit using them in a poll. But of those who do use them, most people will probably be more comfortable with the first one than the second one. Okay, and the data shows that the first one is more widespread among the population than the second one. But to think about what the pronoun is doing here, I'm going to refer to some real data of young people using this grammatical construction. So my data comes from a study that I did of a high school that I call Midland High. This was a school in Bolton, which is a northwest English town, for those of you who don't know. And here it is on a map. My study focused on the language of girls at the school, and I collected data of the girls chatting with one another over a 2-year period, firstly when they were in year 9 and aged 13 to 14, and then when they were in year 10 and aged 14 to 15. The school was in quite an affluent middle-class suburb, but its catchment area extended into more socially disadvantaged areas. And this meant there was a good cross-section of different socioeconomic groups at the school. Now, my study identified, it was an ethnographic study, which meant I studied the way that people were interacting with one another. And I identified 4 social groups in particular. And these ranged along an anti-school to a pro-school continuum. So at the one end, there was the most rebellious and anti-school group the town is, and also the cool and independent populace. And at the other end, there was sort of elitist and trendy pro-school Eden Village clique, who were named after the village that they all lived in, which of course is a pseudonym, but that's where they got their name, and the sensible and studious geeks. Now, you might, if you're a teacher, you might reflect on whether you see these kind of groups in the schools in which you work. Now, if we look at the use of right dislocation across these groups, we can see some really interesting patterns. So this graph shows how frequently the different social groups used right dislocation. So the blue bars show whether right dislocation is used with the more common noun phrase tag type. So this is the one like she's weird, that fronted adverbial bird. And the orange bars show whether the right dislocation used is the less common pronoun type. So she's weird, her. So the first thing to notice is that the anti-school groups, the populars and the townies, use significantly more of this right dislocation construction overall. They've just got bigger bars, irrespective of whether those bars are blue or orange. But secondly, note that the personal pronoun tags increase as groups become increasingly anti-school. So that is to say there are higher orange bars for the populars and the townies than there are for the other groups. So whilst it's not the case that all of the populars and all of the townies were from working class backgrounds, it is true that the girls in these groups tended to orient towards more what we might call working class social practices, particularly in terms of how they used the local space and how they interacted with one another. So these girls were at a secondary school, but other researchers found a correlation with use of right dislocation of social class even in primary school children. So this is another of one of the organisers of today's event. This is work from Julia Snell. And she's done lots of very interesting work looking at the use of grammar by primary school children. Again, I would very much recommend that you look at it. Her research for this particular linguistic item used data collected from 2 primary schools in Middlesbrough in the northeast of England, and she found the same patterns that I did at middle and high. So the more working class orientated children used more right dislocation overall, and the working class children also proportionally used more personal pronoun tags than the middle class children. Okay, so why might it be that children are using these tags at all, and why might some children use them more than others? So to answer this question, we need to think about how structures like this function in everyday language use. So starting with the noun phrase tags, it's been suggested that these tags are information giving. That is to say, they add more information than what is retrievable just from that subject pronoun alone. So that adverbial bird says more than just the she at the beginning of the sentence. So for this reason, it's possible that they help to clarify what the subject of a sentence refers to if there's any ambiguity. And in this sense, they may occur as a consequence of what we might call delayed utterance processing. So somebody says something, they subsequently realise that there's some ambiguity about what they've said, and that's where the noun phrase tag comes in. So given this clarifying function, it's not surprising that everybody uses these at least occasionally, as we all need to clarify what we're saying at some point in our interactions. But these functions don't explain why people use the personal pronoun tags, of course. So here, the tag her is not adding any additional information beyond what is already redeemable from the subject pronoun she, so it can't be clarifying. So to think about how these tags function, it's necessary to examine how they're used every day. So I'm going to play you an extract from a recording with one of my townie girls from my school data, whose pseudonym is Amanda. And she's telling me about an incident in her art class where the teacher asked her to evaluate some pictures. So I'll play this and hopefully you'll be able to hear it, but if not, the transcript's there on the screen. And there are 3 instances of right dislocation, and they're all with personal pronouns, and they're all bolded in the transcript.
Oh, that what you were that? Right.
Oops.
I sit on a table, and on a different table though, but next to me is this girl, she's a goth. I was sat there, oh God, you didn't let us into your party, you. So I was sat there, and she went, well, look at these pictures, and so I went, do you like these? I went, oh, top them. And then she went, wow, they're amazing. I thought, God, you're so different. Why can't you just say the top them? They're amazing. The colours, it's a lovely collage. Like, nice colours.
Okay, so what we see here is that Amanda contrasts herself with the goth girl, as she refers to her, and that provides us with some clues about how she's using right dislocation. So her use here is contrasted with the way the goth girl expresses evaluation. So the expression they're top them, which means they're really great, is clearly evaluative. But also note that the other utterance that she uses, you didn't let me into your party, you, is also implicitly evaluative. She's basically judging the goth girl for a perceived slight against her. But note too that the instances of right dislocation seem to function something about Amanda's identity. So her use of right dislocation to be evaluative is depicted as being blunt and straight talking, whereas the goth girl's way of evaluating is depicted as being quite verbose. And given how Amanda changes her accent when she voices the goth girl, it's also more standardized and by implication perhaps more posh. So going back to the function of these personal pronoun tags then, we might propose that they function to signal when a speaker is being evaluative. This is in line with other research which finds that features of grammar that appear at the right-hand side, so right at the end of clauses and sentences, tend to serve to add focus to what people are uttering, or also to emphasise the speaker's viewpoint about something. And we've also seen that this type of evaluation, which emphasises that something is an evaluation, can be perceived as more direct. So if we reflect on this graph, we might note that personal pronoun tags are used more frequently by the anti-school groups because these are the groups that tend to engage in interactions where evaluation is being emphasised. Now, this isn't to say that they're more evaluative than other social groups, rather that they use particular strategies to be very direct about the fact that they are evaluating other people. Now, of course, this goes along with the stereotype that working class people tend to be more blunt, they're more frank, and they're more direct in their speech than middle class people. So in this way, this style of speech may go along with the type of identities that the anti-school groups are trying to express. Okay, so let's bring all of this understanding of personal pronouns back to what we might understand about the nature of grammar. Okay, so if we consider grammar as a rule book, then the use of personal pronouns in right dislocation might be considered wrong, because the rule book prescribes that pronouns should avoid repetition, and avoiding repetition makes communication clearer. But if we think about grammar as a toolkit, then the use of personal pronouns in right dislocation is actually pretty skillful, because it helps speakers to be more expressive about their viewpoints. So these tags are also socially meaningful in that they help to situate speakers in relation to their identities, both in terms of their position in a specific interaction, but also in relation to their more general sense of identity. Now, this toolkit view of grammar helps us to recognise two important things. Firstly, that children already have significant skills when it comes to language use and identity, that's the first thing. And the second thing is that identity is really important in how we use language. So I want to finish by explaining the importance of these two things a little further. So being told that the language that you use is not correct when it works efficiently and effectively in your everyday interactions is confusing and demoralising. And I say this both as a linguist and as someone who was also once a child. So what are you supposed to think if you're told that pronouns avoid repetition, but you actually regularly use these all the time in perfectly functional ways? On the other hand, being shown how your language is interesting and skillful can build confidence and self-esteem. Teaching children about grammar can empower children when it acknowledges how they use language structure to be expressive and creative. Secondly, interventions that aim to develop linguistic skills where that skill is solely associated with a particular identity type, such as being posh, is likely to fail when taught to those who don't identify with that identity type. And Sarah Spencer's talked about this in her work. So even if the emphasis is placed on altering a young person's language skills, it will inevitably be seen as an attempt to alter their identity too. And of course, our identities ground us. So it's not something that anybody is willing to give up easily. So making young people engage with grammar is likely to be much more effective if the grammar taught reflects how language actually works in ways that are recognisable to them. Okay, so to conclude, of course, the title of this talk and what everybody today has been asked to talk about is, what does grammar mean to me? Well, for me, grammar is a toolkit and a resource. Understanding how language is structured can help us to appreciate the skills we have and to recognise new ones we might develop. In terms of the second question that people were asked to consider today, what place does grammar have in our schools? Grammar is in our schools. So children use it all the time to be expressive and to reflect their identities. Making them realise this is the best way to help them to develop their linguistic skills further and help them want to develop their linguistic skills further. So if we're teaching children about pronouns, by all means, we should show them the rules which guide how pronouns may be used, but we should also teach them about how we adapt and repurpose these rules to use language in expressive, creative, and skillful ways. Thanks for listening. I hope you have questions.
Okay, thank you, Emma. As promised, we'll have a short break before Debra talks. She's our next speaker. So we'll just take 2 minutes or so just to refresh our brains before we hear from Debra. So it's 31 minutes past 4 now. So we'll start at 33 minutes past 4. In the meantime, if you don't need your brain refreshing, then feel free to add questions to the Padlet. I understand that you may have been concentrating on Emma's slides and making sure that you could see what she was presenting. But now might be a good time to start adding questions to the Padlet if you've not done so already. I'm just going to put a note in the chat so you can do that, and we'll start back at 33 minutes past 4. Okay. So I'm just going to mute until that point, and then when I start talking again, I'll introduce Debra, and then we'll continue. Okay, I think we'll start back now. So we're next going to hear from Debra Myhill. She's a professor of education, director of the Centre for Research and Writing at the University of Exeter. Her research is principally in the areas of language and literacy, with a focus on the teaching of writing and using talk about writing to develop understanding. Her research has been funded by the Arts Council and the UK Research and Innovation Councils. So Debra, over to you.
Thank you. And thank you, Emma, for your talk. It's a great start to the session. I want to start by reading you the opening of The Iron Man. So sit back and listen. The Iron Man came to the top of the cliff. How far had he walked? Nobody knows. Where had he come from? Nobody knows. How was he made? Nobody knows. Taller than a house, the Iron Man stood at the top of the cliff, on the very brink, in the darkness. The wind sang through his iron fingers. His great iron head, shaped like a dustbin, but as big as a bedroom, slowly turned to the right, slowly turned to the left. His iron ears turned this way, that way. He was hearing the sea. His eyes, like headlamps, glowed white, then red, then infrared, searching the sea. Never before had the Iron Man seen the sea. What I'm really interested in is writing, the craft of writing. And in particular, how can we help young children and young people in school to become confident, competent, and independent writers? Students who enjoy writing. I'm interested in how we can help them to develop a feel for the written word, how to develop a sense of themselves as authors, not just children who write, but children who can craft and shape language. In that opening to The Iron Man, Ted Hughes draws us into the story, but not just through the narrative action of that Iron Man appearing, but also through how it's written, how the sentences are structured and the rhythms they create, the images used, the patterns of repetition, the detail in the description. I know the children we teach aren't all destined to be poet laureates, but that craftedness is at the heart of writing. And so the more we can help children to develop a kind of sensitivity to the language choices they make, the more we're empowering them as writers. So you might be thinking, well, what's this got to do with grammar, or indeed with the teaching of writing? Well, I think that one of the problems has been that for too long now, the argument about the place of grammar in the school curriculum has been dogged by ideology and polemic. You're either for grammar or against grammar. Grammar is either the salvation for all writing sins, or it's the spawn of the devil. Real critical discussion about why grammar might or might not have a place in the curriculum is scarce. And thinking about children's learning, even more scarce. That's partly why Emma's talk was so interesting, because it drew out an idea of what children are actually doing with the language they use. And actually, ever since that very first national curriculum came in 1988, grammar has been in the national curriculum in some form or another, but it's wobbled rather uncertainly from version to version until 2013. So our current version, it's stopped wobbling and it's there like a megalith, right at the heart of the English curriculum, particularly for primary. And you could talk a lot more about the difference in the national curriculum between what happens at the primary end of things and what happens for secondary English teachers. And without a doubt, that current curriculum gives greater primacy to grammar than any preceding English curriculum. And of course, it's the statutory grammar test at age 11 that's making sure that grammar is taught. But why grammar's in the curriculum is a lot less clear. In some ways, it's linked to a long-standing conservative tradition, which equates grammar with standards, standards in writing, and of course, by a very curious sachet, standards in society. Deborah Cameron, the Oxford professor of language, once noted how Norman Tebbit linked bad English with a decline in moral standards and people having no imperative to stay out of crime, reflecting a tendency to see correct English as part of the struggle against dark social forces. Now, Michael Gove, who was the education minister who presided over the current curriculum, in many ways stands fair and square within that standards tradition. If you teach children the right things, they'll become the kind of people our nation needs. This is what he said in 2013, and listen out for the word policed. Visit the most exclusive pre and prep schools in London, like Wetherby in Notting Hill, where artistic and creative leaders like Stella McCartney send their children, and you'll find children learning to read using traditional phonic methods, times tables and poetry learnt by heart, grammar and spelling rigorously policed, the narrative of British history properly taught. And on that foundation, those children then move to schools like Eton and Westminster, where the medieval cloisters connect seamlessly to the corridors of power. We could spend the whole afternoon just talking about that quote. But what I really want to draw attention to is that idea that grammar needs to be policed. If grammar has to be policed, presumably children are committing writing crimes out there. I was on one of the advisory groups which looked at this curriculum back in 2012, but as Gove famously said, advisors advise, ministers decide, and thus indeed it was. So where does that leave grammar now? We have a cohort of children being taught largely to identify grammar features so that they can label them or underline them in the grammar test, and so they can put right standard English errors in that test. Now, I'm not arguing that grammatical errors don't matter, but what I'm saying is it's a rather impoverished way of thinking about the place of grammar in the curriculum. So it all sounds as though I'm anti-grammar, really, doesn't it? And actually just as ideological about it as anyone else. But actually I'm not at all. One of my central arguments is that we waste time in these binary debates about whether we should or shouldn't teach grammar, when we really need to be spending a lot more time thinking about children's learning about language and where and how grammar is useful or not useful. So I see a genuinely creative, constructive place for grammar in the curriculum as a resource for learning about being a writer. But actually, before I develop that idea more fully, I do want to put another argument on the table. Because of that tendency to debate grammar from largely ideological perspectives, I sometimes think we haven't really thought enough about the full range of arguments there might be around grammar. And of course, one argument might be that children are entitled to know about and understand the grammar, the system of their own language, as of course many children do around the world. In a way, we're talking there about grammar for its own sake, as a body of knowledge. Is it not possible that knowing about your own language and how it's constructed is intrinsically interesting, or at least could be intrinsically interesting? If it's taught by teachers who are curious themselves and interested in the structure of language, there could be all sorts of creative, playful, and inquiry-based ways of looking at the structure of language that doesn't ever involve exercises, drills, and worksheets. It's always seemed a bit strange to me, really, that the rich tradition of linguistics that we've got in this country isn't actually reflected in our curriculum very much at all. And that might be in part because English teachers tend to come through an English literature route, people like me. The argument that grammar has a place in the curriculum as a body of knowledge in its own right actually is a legitimate argument, and it's one that I respect, even if it isn't particularly the position that I take myself. Now, as I said at the start of this talk, my principal interest is in writing and the teaching of writing. And of course, that rejection, a historic rejection really, of grammar as part of an English curriculum at the Dartmouth Conference in the USA in 1966 was premised on a pretty large consensus that teaching children grammar had no impact on their competence as writers. And of course, they were quite right. My own experience of learning grammar at a grammar school was of doing parsing and 6-column analysis on occasional Fridays and English the rest of the week. And never the twain did meet. It never occurred to me that there was any connection at all between what I was doing with columns and underlining and what we were doing in English lessons. But why on earth would learning what a subject and a predicate is on a Friday help you write a better story on a Monday? especially as in your own writing, you would inevitably be using subjects and predicates all the time anyway. And since then, a string of meta-analyses have actually reiterated this argument that teaching children grammar has no impact on their writing. Now, one problem with that body of research is that none of those studies, and actually there are very few of them, that formed that evidence base really looked at whether creating a more integrated, purposeful attention to how grammar works in writing would help students to be more confident writers. Let's look at another example. And I thought, why not start with the fronted adverbial, the ubiquitous fronted adverbial? It must be a bit of a theme for today's session, I think. Listen to this short extract from Roald Dahl's BFG. It's when Sophie is with the Queen at Buckingham Palace, having told her about the BFG and about the child stealing giants. And it's the first appearance of the BFG to the Queen. So it's when the Queen sees him for the first time. Then out he came, 24 feet tall, wearing his black cloak with the grace of a nobleman, still carrying his long trumpet in one hand. He strode magnificently across the palace lawn towards the window. The maid screamed. The Queen gasped. Sophie waved. Just listen again to that long sentence with its 3 in a row fronted adverbials and think about what the effect is of positioning them at the start of the sentence. 24 feet tall, wearing his black cloak with the grace of a nobleman, still carrying his long trumpet in one hand, he strode magnificently across the palace lawn towards the window. The fronted adverbials foreground his appearance. What the Queen actually sees when he appears. He's 24 foot tall. He's wearing a black coat like a nobleman, and he has a trumpet in his hand. The adverbials positioned there have a purpose, not to get a better mark. They're part of the crafting of this moment in the plot. And of course, we could also have noticed the sentence patterning here. The first short sentence, then out he came. The long sentence with those fronted adverbials, which is really the great reveal. And then the 3 repeat structure sentences to capture the reaction. The maid screamed, the Queen gasped, Sophie waved. The point is not you should front your adverbials or you should use short sentences, but that these are choices that you might make. And there are others available and different choices which could be made. Writing draws on a repertoire of choices. And what we've called them at Exeter is that language provides you as a writer with a repertoire of infinite possibilities. And this is what we've been researching at Exeter now for more than 20 years, which is a bit frightening, I have to say. And we've done at least 15 research studies exploring that relationship between grammar and writing in various ways, initially focusing more on what patterns of language were present in children's writing at different ages, then looking more at how teaching might help children to be more agentic, more knowing writers. We've drawn a lot on Michael Halliday and Ronald Carter in the way that we've thought about this. Halliday's idea of grammar as a semiotic resource, a tool for meaning making, is key to the way we've worked. And alongside that, his emphasis on looking at grammar in terms of function, what it's doing, not just the form. He's not really interested in where are the nouns, but what are the nouns doing here? And that's really what we've been interested in. And Ronald Carter too influenced our thinking about where we were going, not only in all the work he led on the scrapped language in the National Curriculum Project, but his notion of grammar as choice, the idea that grammatical choices are part of the way in which we shape meaning in writing. So pedagogically, this means making connections for learners between the writing they're learning about and the grammatical choices that might occur in that type of writing. There's a learning purpose to the grammar in making visible how that kind of writing might be crafted. It connects reading and writing, being a reader and being a writer, and encourages the children to see the writer in the text that they read and to be the reader of their own writing. And crucially, the way we've tended to work calls on a lot of discussion, a lot of talk about texts, about choices, about children's own writing as texts, really rich metalinguistic talk. about the relationship between a grammatical choice and what it might be doing in the text. And actually that talk, our most recent research, is flagging just how important that talk is. And we've done lots of different kinds of studies, randomized controlled trials, experimental designs, longitudinal studies, qualitative studies, text analysis. And we haven't really set out to prove or disprove whether grammar teaching works. We've set out really to understand more about the teaching and learning contexts and if, where and how grammar can be helpful to children in their learning. So what we've got is robust evidence of grammar being taught where it has a positive effect on student outcomes, but equally evidence of where it doesn't. And we've been able to flesh this out in detail to really look at what are the factors, what are the circumstances that help or hinder real learning about writing and being a writer. And one thing that this is also highlighted, which is obvious really if you're a teacher or a teacher educator, is that everything hinges upon how the teacher teaches. There's no silver bullet, no quick fix to any aspect of learning, let alone writing or grammar. If a teacher is addressing grammar through exercises identifying word classes, then the grammar is unlikely to affect how well a student writes, or more importantly, how well a student understands being a writer. But if a teacher does embed the grammar meaningfully within the writing lesson, making those kinds of connections between the grammar and communicative or rhetorical effects through that high quality talk, then it's much more likely to have an impact on student writing. So if I draw this to an end, my argument would really be that we need to move forward in that debate about grammar, avoiding the stuck in the mud binaries of grammar is good or grammar is bad, where actually the same old arguments are used again and again. We need to look more closely at what's actually happening in the classroom, at the nature of teaching and learning in order to see what the role might be for grammar in the curriculum. Where the focus really is on how choice works in different texts and contexts, and where children are allowed to make their own choices, even ones that the teacher doesn't agree with, and where they can justify why they're making those choices. Grammar becomes one way of thinking about being a writer. It is explicit in that it makes visible all that language patterning and language possibilities of writing. And it's developing knowledge about writing that can be shared within a classroom community of writers. But I'm not arguing that grammar alone is a pedagogy for writing. It must sit within a broader pedagogy for the teaching of writing, just as one aspect of learning about writing. No one's going to become a better writer just through meaningful attention to grammar. And in our current educational climate, children won't become better writers if grammar is treated as a writing by numbers or checklist issue where certain grammatical features need to be put in to make your writing better. In our research of classroom practice, we've got a category in some of our analysis for what we call it when this happens, and we call it the deploying tendency. Grammar is almost being taught as something where you just need to deploy it occasionally. And so long as you've deployed it, then you're likely to be getting a good mark for it. Putting an adverbial at the front of your sentence or using a passive will not of itself make your writing any better. It's the authorial decision making about why you might or might not do that, which is at the core of learning about authorship. We've actually also done several research projects with Arvon, the Creative Writing Foundation. And the founders of Arvon, John Fairfax and John Mote, had this idea of running residential creative writing courses because they believed people could be taught how to write. And one thing they said is that writing is the exercise of a craft, and that every craft has its rudiments that must be taught. I think we feel that grammar is part of that craft and part of those rudiments. And of course, Ted Hughes was one of their writing tutors. If you remember that opening to the Iron Man that I started with, actually, it had 2 fronted adverbials, a passive, at least 3 sets of parenthetical commas, but they're there not to score points on assessment, but because they make the text work as an opening. It's their function which matters, not their presence or their grammatical form. So I'll end by quoting Maya Angelou, partly because I just like always quoting Maya Angelou anyway. And she said, As a writer, I know that I must select studiously the nouns, pronouns, verbs, adverbs, etc., and by a careful syntactical arrangement make readers laugh, reflect, or riot. I'd argue that real understanding, meaningful understanding of grammar, gives children as authors the power to choose whether to make their readers laugh, reflect, or riot. And for me, that's a purposeful and empowering role for grammar in the curriculum. Thank you.
Thank you, Deborah, for a great talk. Excellent. So we'll take another couple of minutes. So it's 53 minutes past 4 now. So we'll take 2 minutes, and we'll start again at 5 to 5. If people want to add questions to the Padlet, we've got a number up there now. Some for Emma, some for Deborah, and some more general questions. Feel free to upvote those questions so you don't have to type them out again. If you've got questions particularly for Deborah, just note that and we'll colour them in a particular colour. If you can't access the Padlet for whatever reason and it won't let you post, send me a direct message in the chat. I'll post it for you, and then we can make sure that your question's asked. So we'll just take another minute. We'll start again at 5 to 5. So I'm just going to mute, and yes, we'll take a little break. Okay, that was quite a brief break, but we'll press on so that we can keep to time. So we'll next hear from Michael Rosen. Michael Rosen is Professor of Children's Literature at Goldsmiths, University of London. As I'm sure you know, he's an author, journalist, presenter, and educator, and runs workshops for children and teachers about how we read and write books. He's published over 200 books, most recently an account of his near-death experience with COVID-19. So over to you, Michael. I think you're muted just at the moment, though.
Thanks very much, Chris. Yeah, reader I lived. I wonder if I, on the spur of the moment, pick up on some of the things that Emma and Deborah have said. First of all, I think the elephant in the room that we're struggling with is what is grammar? And the problem here is that both Emma and Deborah have both conceptualized it as somehow or other being virtually the same as language, that it's the rules of language and the rest of it. This isn't the case. If we have a cliff and then we decide how to describe the cliff, we use words like rocks and pebbles and grit and gravel. These are two separate things. The cliff is an a priori thing, reality, that exists, and then scientists and whoever come along and describe it. That's exactly the same with language. Language exists, I'm using it now. Now, how you choose to describe it is a whole other matter. The grammar that people are talking about and that people keep talking about is not the grammar, using, interestingly, a definite article for a particular reason here. Instead of it being the grammar, it is one grammar of many. And in fact, there are many ways to describe language. And the one we're talking about, I'll argue all along, is incredibly limited and incredibly narrowing in its own terms, no matter what we ask it to do. So, for example, Emma used the phrase present tense. Well, some linguists don't even think there is tense in English. Sorry, sometimes I get muddled. It's partly post-COVID. All right, so some people think that we have time aspect in language and that we have a variety of means of expressing time aspect. So we use verbs, but we can also use adverbs like tomorrow, yesterday, and we have a variety of ways of doing it. So this is absolutely crucial, if you like. So there isn't just tense in English or in languages. There are ways of expressing, because tense, the way and the reason why we have it in our English grammar is entirely derived from Latin, where Latin, a verb form, and of course the Latin that we looked at was entirely the written Latin of an elite. So we don't know how everybody else spoke. It was just the written language of the elite. And in that form, that highly standardized classical form, then the verb form, like the example that Emma gave, eats, immediately could be latched on, could be tied to a time aspect. But of course, you know and I know that we use verb forms very loosely in English. And indeed, if we want to construct an idea of futurity, we've got at least two ways, will and going to. And technically, these aren't tenses in the old sense. We're using the auxiliaries. So the very idea of tense we can contest, because think of the cliff and the rock. This is the same thing. We're expressing something to do with reality, namely, I'm going to do something or I did do something. And we have many, many different ways of doing it. And to ascribe it to one form and use that phrase present tense, I would argue is giving a priority or a hierarchy to this thing we're calling grammar. And precisely for that reason, we can see that in primary schools, what in actual fact is the grammar, it is entirely based on not on standard English written grammar. That's what it is. It's purely a way of describing standard English and by and large, just sentences. And I'll come on to that in a moment. So in other words, it's a sentence grammar of standard English. This is incredibly limited. So all the fascinating material that Emma gave us, that's out the door. That isn't in primary schools. You don't look at any of that stuff. Or you'll see on the example that I've given that you can switch on, you can click on, you'll see that there's this very loose, feeble description of informal and formal, as if that's somehow or other grammatical term, which turns up on the SATs tests. So that's the nearest. So it isn't even a grammatical term. It's actually moving into sociolinguistics and social psychology. But it's just been slammed in there because of the anxiety about slang and non-standard language. And then when it comes to pronouns that Emma was talking about, well, the crucial thing about pronouns is that in actual fact, all those reasons that Emma gave, but there's another intralinguistic point, which is they are central to the way in which we stick language together. So if we put up a Hallidayan term, cohesion, then the crucial point about cohesion is not just that it's pronouns, but it's actually things that, aren't called pronouns, like this and that, which Emma highlighted. So in fact, we could create a grammar of cohesion. In fact, I have done. I wrote an article about it in the Sixth Form magazine produced by the English and Media Centre. And we can see there are many parts to the grammar of cohesion. And we don't have to get stuck on pronouns because we can see that we do it in all sorts of different ways. In speech, we do it, of course, using your hands and your head and your eyes. But in text, we have a variety of ways of doing it, from sentence to sentence, across paragraphs, across chapters, and across whole books. In fact, it's fascinating to do it. And you don't get lumbered with this kind of parsing and this Latinate version of saying, here is a pronoun, it is doing this, here is that, and it's doing something different. Because in actual fact, it's within a grammar of something that is coherent, also another grammatical word or another linguistic term, but a cohesion across whole texts. Now, in my terms, I think we're really motoring. That's really interesting. Interesting that Emma used the phrase me no like socks, I think is what you said. In actual fact, that is a standard form in Caribbean dialect. I was sitting next to a Caribbean guy in hospital for several weeks, and it's precisely how he spoke. He did say, me no like something, me no want this. So in actual fact, this reminds us as to how dominated we are by the standard forms, that there are so many dialect forms that they're interesting. So when you said you've divided your social groups into 4, I can reveal to you, Emma, that in actual fact, I was all 4 when I was at school. So this reminds us that in actual fact, we are bidialectical, we're tridialectical, we're quadridialectical, dialectal, across time, across space. Our languages change. And of course, we move around it with our language and our use of language, depending on the context. I'll come to that in just a moment. So this, when Debra was speaking, talking about the craft of writing, now, it seems to me when we talk about the craft of writing, we're spreading much, much wider than anything to do with what just that term, grammar as used in primary schools in relation to GPS, used to be SPAG. We're talking about the whole aspect of stylistics and purpose, a much wider and more interesting and much more fertile area. So for me, crucial to the craft of writing is immersion, imitation, invention, and investigation. Easy to remember with 4 eyes like that. And with those, I could expand on that in great detail. We may or may not find that we refer to this SPAG grammar, which is what I'll call it, in order to remind ourselves I'm talking about something ring-fenced within primary schools. So for example, with investigation, I found one of the most fruitful methods that I've sort of invented is what I call secret strings. That if you invite children to, and young children this is, to have a text in front of them and to find strings, to find secret strings that even the writers don't know about, that they're poem detectives and can find links, any link at all. If you can justify it, it's a link, it's a string between this bit and that bit. And it could be because of how it sounds, because of how it's shaped, because of a pattern you spot, because of opposites, of similarities to do with images, pictures, as I might call them, feelings, then suddenly a whole text becomes available in terms of its structure, its nature, yes, its grammar. And I find that children aged 6, 7, 8, 9, 23, 103, that's where my father's cousin died, that you can actually find these strings across language, no matter what text you put in front of them. And this takes us back to that issue of cohesion, because then we find that there's a grammar of linkage in texts, much more powerful, I'd say, than this narrow form of grammar of standard English within sentences. Now, when it came to the Iron Man, Deborah, that you showed us, for me, the elephant in the room is this crucial thing that every scriptwriter knows about, but strangely is never studied in schools, which is called reveal conceal. You only have to spend half an hour with a scriptwriter of any sort, and they will tell you to hold back, not reveal that, not show this, at the same time as you show part of your hand. This is one of the great motors of text that pulls you through. It's not grammar, it's not even really stylistics. It's just being clever about writing. So Ted Hughes did classic reveal conceal approaches, if you like, in that first paragraph. And guess where he got it from? Hamlet. What's the opening of Hamlet? Who's there? One of the classic opening lines of any fiction, any piece of literature ever. And, you know, to bring grammar to it doesn't really do it. We just know it's a question. And the moment someone asks a question, who's there, you want to know the answer. And of course, Ted Hughes has done exactly the same. You pose questions, you pose mysteries, you create hauntings where they are there or aren't there. And then if somebody answers, is that really the person who should be there or shouldn't be there? And as we know, Hamlet is in its own way a kind of whodunit in a variety of ways. Now, why have we got grammar in primary schools? Well, I think, Deborah, you slightly fudged it. It's entirely because of one single report, the Bew report of 2011, and it wasn't even the interim report, it was the report that came out between the interim and the finished report, because Michael Gove intervened and said he wanted it. And that's because that committee, none of whom were linguists, decided that grammar had right and wrong answers. It's all there in black and white. I'm not making this up, but because grammar has right and wrong answers, it will be a good way to assess teachers. That's what the grammar's doing. So the tail is wagging the dog. This is purely, it was brought in not because it's good or right or somebody had thought about what it is. All the people drew of start with was 50s, 60s and vague public school education, and put that in and decided that because they went amo, amamus, amant, and you couldn't say amatis, but you had to say amo before you said amatis, so there's a right and a wrong, and they'd done their Latin homework that way, that's what you could do with what they thought was grammar. And it came in precisely because of that intervention. Then they hired some linguists, and I can name them names, but I'm not going to now. And they came and they delivered the SPAG grammar, and they delivered it. And would you know, Michael Gove thought that some of it was insufficient because they hadn't put the subjunctive in. So he flicked his fingers and he said, I want the subjunctive. And the linguists scratched their heads and went, oh, hang on, there's some debate as to whether English has actually got a subjunctive. And Gove said, I want it. That gives you an indication of how politicized, I mean, Deborah's talked about politics and sort of dividing things, how politicized it was. And indeed, when it comes to the fronted adverbial, well, there's a laugh here because the linguist who actually mentioned it only did because I think Gove or somebody said, I want a bit more. And this guy popped up with fronted adverbial. It was hardly a term that existed. Fronting has existed for a long time. When I was a kid, we used to call it inverting, which is not right either. But anyway, fronting. So fronted adverbial, he now regrets that he put it in. And let's have a laugh here. It isn't even grammar. I mean, it really isn't. Within their terms, it's not grammar, it's stylistics. So if you want to talk about how things are put together, there isn't anything grammatical, it isn't anything syntactic really about a fronted adverbial in English. And if you want to contrast with German, if you put a fronted adverbial into German, you have to then invert the verb. So this is in German, it does. It's almost like the kind of invisible hand of somebody who's got German in their heads and said, oh, fronted adverbials are terribly important, because if you say tomorrow in German, you have to say go we instead of we go. In fact, if you look at Old English texts, they did the same. So as far as the business of grammar and writing and why that got disconnected, it's a very simple reason. I don't know whether you know this, Deborah, but the data they had was in fact 20 years of O-levels when I did O-level. So they had the example of us being taught grammar exactly as you described, box analysis, clause analysis, all that stuff at secondary school, not primary school. And they gave us that stuff and they found there was no correlation over 20 years and tens of thousands of exam scripts. There was no correlation between the grammar marks and what they used to call composition, where we could write about trees or bananas or my granddad or my holiday. And there was no connection between the marks. Yes, I take your point. If you do a different kind of grammar teaching, then maybe there'll be more correlation, but we're not in that ball game. First of all, grammar isn't really taught at secondary schools in that way at all. In fact, there's a lot more interesting things they do with language, like lexical fields, which I find is a really, I learned that from my son only about 3 or 4 years ago and found it a very fruitful way to look at language. It's not really grammar indeed, because it's semantics. It's saying there's a semantic field and there's many different ways of putting semantics. We could say tomorrow and soon and a whole set of things to do with the future, say, and that becomes very fruitful. So I don't, God knows why the fronted adverbial, people talking about it as grammar, it's on a grammar paper. It isn't, it's stylistics. And then I'm very interested, Deborah, that you're talking about choice. And in fact, we've looked very well and fruitfully at the examples of writers and indeed school students using choice. This reminds us of Halliday, M.A.K. Halliday, Michael Halliday, someone who I was lucky enough to know, and my father very well did courses with him. And of course, what Michael Halliday reminds us, in fact, he created a little schema, which he called tenor, field, and mode. And this little schema, this little set of schemes, actually is very fruitful for us looking at choice, because it's not only some of the other phenomena that people have already spoken about, but tenor meant let's look at the participants in this language moment. Who is there? Indeed, Emma looked at who is there in her description of the girls talking. It is absolutely crucial. And we see them. In fact, Emma has shown us them being a bit bidialectal. So the participants in that conversation are crucial to the choices. And then he said, look at field. This is another way of saying subject, theme. I was very interested, Halliday, in the word subject, because his argument was we have subjects in sentences because more often than not, it is in fact the subject in our other sense, the theme. Yeah. And then the mode, indeed, very important, slightly reduced by the National Literacy Strategy to rather prescriptive use of genre. But in actual fact, he then suggested this third idea of mode, that texts have types. That here am I talking to you in a particular kind of way, because this is within a formal part university, part not university context. We're talking about theoretical things, and we're moving between abstract and concrete in a particular kind of way. The students that Emma showed us were talking in a different way, their points of reference. That's because their mode of talking is different from our mode of talking now. So this leads me, and I must keep an eye on the time, this leads me to where I was going to begin, which was to think about the sign no smoking. So I'm guessing that all of us here have some time or another been in a room or a train or a station or somewhere, a bus, and seen the sign no smoking. So I'm going to put it to you, how is it you know what it means? I'm going to assume that you understand by this sign that you are not allowed to smoke, but it doesn't say that. It says no smoking. So how is it we know that that's what it means? Because no smoking as a phrase could mean all sorts of other things. It appears in sentences, larger utterances, no smoking gun. In posh things of the past, no smoking jacket. So it can appear in lots of other ways. But when we see no smoking on its own, we know that it means you're not supposed to smoke here. So primary school SPAG grammar, all it can tell us, or if it was a little bit more, yet more terminological, would tell us the no is a determiner. This reminds us, by the way, that the terminology of SPAG grammar, you only have to spend 5 minutes on a computer to find that many of it is disputed. It's changed over the years. You know, one year it's connectives, then we're not allowed to use connectives. Suddenly it's conjunctions. Things are demonstratives, then they're not, they're adjectives. Things are it's like and that reminds us, of course, we have cliff and stone. They're two different things. Same thing. We have language, terminology. These are two different things. So anyway, we have no as a determiner. What is smoking? Well, according to the grammar, it's a gerund. So that's to say is a present participle that's been turned into a noun. So we're not supposed to. So we've already used 3 terms just to describe one, gerund. And would you believe there's also something called a verbal noun? So this is the kind of terminological morass that grammarians get into in their attempt to try and describe this thing that is much more fluid. There is a rather disgusting phrase, but I'm going to say it anyway. It's a bit like trying to nail diarrhea to the wall, because language is fluid. It's fluid for a very particular purpose because we are fluid. Our behaviors are fluid. Our social purpose and social functioning is fluid. So why wouldn't the terminology be fluid? So the attempt to make it so incredibly precise, the why you have unbelievable war games, they're hysterical, by the way, between grammarians. I mean, just follow the arguments, for example, between the grammarian who wants to say that the word before in some context is a preposition, and others want to say in other contexts it's a conjunction, and another grammarian saying, no, they're exactly the same and fulfilling the same function. You know, they come to blows, blood on the floor. So crucial to all this then is choice, as we say. So essentially, I've said that already in reply to something. So it's in my version of what is grammar as it's taught, it's the name for bits, and it's the rules for constructing phrases, clauses, and sentences. I don't accept that those are rules. They're patterns, they're conventions, they are due to time and place, the participants in them, and it is dependent or contingent on those. It's not that they are just simply rules. There are no police. Now, people try to be, but that's just a farce. You know, you only have to take a poet like E.E. Cummings, and you suddenly find that, well, they're not writing according to those rules. You could find singers today, tomorrow, you just find they're not conforming. So rules in the very loosest sense, you know, they're not like the guidance that says no ball games in the playground or indeed no smoking. You know, these are patterns of the way in which people coexist, using language to coexist and indeed not to coexist, to have conflict, you know, to send gunboats to Jersey. So it isn't a grammar of the language. It is not a grammar of language in use, because it doesn't cover. Let's have a look and see what that primary school grammar does not cover. It doesn't cover conversation. The grammar of conversation, if you like, has its own name. It's called pragmatics. It certainly doesn't provide the grammar of poetry, I can tell you that. It doesn't provide the grammar of song or of film scripts or TV. So we're here for this. If I just put that together, conversation, poetry, song, film, and TV, this is a massive amount of language use. And this primary grammar doesn't even work for that, because most of that stuff is, quotes, wrong, or it's informal, it's just put away over there. In fact, if you look at the SPAG example I've given you, you're supposed to distinguish between formal, i.e. right, and informal, not appropriate. And of course, as I've said, this is largely based on Latin, and the Latin, let's keep saying this, the Latin was in actual fact, the Latin we know and the Latin we were taught was only the written language of an elite, an educated elite. So it's a very specific language use. And yet we're asked to find something called an infinitive. Plenty of people argue, linguists quite sensibly, is that we don't have an infinitive in English. The infinitive is a description. So those of you who know French, if you say the infinitive of the word to eat is manger, it's one word. In English, we don't have infinitives of that form, right? We don't have an infinitive verb form. We have to say to go, or we ought to say go is the infinitive. The idea that to go, and that's why you got the ludicrous rubbish about split infinitives. That's the kind of thing, and indeed tenses, as I've already mentioned. So what's the message of this? So I would say that this kind of grammar goes beyond, indeed, what Emma and Deborah have said. I believe it has what I would call an implied ideology. So that's to say a message is coming off this stuff to primary school students, all right? That language is somehow written, that standard English is language, or if it isn't all of language, it's the best language, yeah? And to use it, you have to have these names and rules. This is the message that's going on in schools at the moment. You know, a lovely teacher of my child, I went in for, you know, can you imagine me for a parents' evening? So anyway, so in a parents' evening, and the teacher put in front of us a piece of writing by my youngest and said it's absolutely terrific because he's embedding his relative clauses and he's expanding his noun phrases. And this was equivalent to writing. Now I write, you may have noticed, and I don't think ever, how am I going to expand this noun clause? I never think, how am I going to embed this relative clause? I rarely even think about that great distinction between one kind of relative clause and another. In fact, I still get it muddled, even though I did exams on it. And I've taught SPAG to my son, you know, the whole year, partly as an experiment in order to see what it was all about. So language is always language in use. It is never this bottled, idealized form with non-real sentences made up by examiners in order to earn their salary. This ludicrous examples that are there in SPAG tests and in all these textbooks quite often are wrong even on their own terms, all right? Language is always language in use. It is always specific to how it's used for different purposes, different situations, different moments in time. So there's always a specificity about it, and that is interfused with the kind of language it is. Yeah. So going back to no smoking, it's crucial to that. How do we get to know it? Because we were told that's what it means. You're not allowed to smoke. Mum, what does that mean? It means you're not allowed to smoke. But also that it's context contingent. In other words, it goes up in places where people might want to smoke. Yeah. I mean, there's no point in putting it up somewhere where, you know, out of doors, say, or it's totally contingent on the idea that people might want to smoke there and then. So these are contingent situations. Now, I find I've got to keep an eye on the time here, so I probably better just finish here. I will just say there is a crucial methodological problem with this particular kind of grammar, because if you ask yourself the question, where are these so-called rules and terms, where are they derived from? Yeah, where do they come from? And how come that they argue so often about these terms and rules? Because if you just spend a few minutes, you find they really do come to blows over it. And I think I have the reason. It's because most of it is self-referential. It derives its rules from itself, not from concrete, real situations. So that's why Halliday and others, for example, Del Hymes, let me recommend looking at him as well, all right? So it keeps trying to derive whatever rule that you want to think of, fronting or whatever, on its rules. In actual fact, quite often it strays into what is sometimes called semantics. So if you take one of its rules over command, all right, the SPAG demands that commands can only come, and it's not actually quite expressed that way, when there's a verbal form, a verb form, which we were taught was the imperative, don't do that, that's a command. And now let's actually look at that socially. What are commands? You can command in any number of ways. You can command with that form, the don't or do form of the English verb, yeah. But you can also do it by going, you mustn't do that, you mustn't do that. Just try and think of other ways in which you can command. So in other words, I'm saying it's feeble methodologically and quite often derives its reasons from semantics, even though it's claiming to only get its rules from itself, which in itself is a weakness. So you've just taken an example here, adverb. Can there be anything weaker and more useless than that term? Okay, so we have adjective, reasonably useful word, because we have the idea that we have nouns and adjectives come along and describe the noun. And then we decide that we've got this thing called an adverb. And an adverb, what can it do? Well, it can affect a verb, it can affect an adjective, it can affect an adverb, and it can also affect a whole sentence. In fact, we used to call them sentence adverbs. It is used, you know, if you show this to a scientist, they just laugh because it's no good at all. It doesn't serve its purpose. And also it's misleading to young children because it's got the word verb in it. So you think, fair enough, if you go, I ran out the room quickly, then quickly is to do with ran, and it's got an ly, and so well, ly words are adverbs. No, they're not, because we've got lovely. So, you know, that in itself is misleading. And then we say, oh, well, adverb, it describes verbs. Oh, yeah, also, oh, yeah, it does actually, you can use it to describe adjectives, because you can say a very fast boat. So very is sort of, that's an adverb as well. Why? I don't know. Why haven't you got another word for it? Well, because I don't know. It goes back to the origins of it. So we have weak terminology. I've already mentioned tense. Famously, listen to football commentary. You'll even get a construction in football commentary that will go something like, he thinks he's going to get a pen. Now that is all in the past, right? He thinks, it meant he thought he should have got a penalty, but it's expressed as he thinks he's going to get a pen. So there's a whole construction that disobeys all the rules. And of course, they're not rules, because why should football commentators? They're not obeying rules. They're obeying the rules of what Halliday called us, the field, the tenor, and the mode. That's what they're doing. They're not corresponding to the grammatical rules laid down by Spag. And yet they've created a beautiful thing of, in actual fact, getting us into the immediacy of the moment. He thinks he's going to get a pen. And we're laughing because, you know, what did he do? He dived, or even dove, as Americans would say. So there we are. So we have, are there alternatives? All right. I believe there are. All right. We've already mentioned Halliday. All right. Which then leads on to a whole interesting area around the grammar of genres, the grammar of text types, the grammar of situations that produce language, the grammar of pragmatics. And in fact, I've always found that in working with children, that my starting point is immersion, it's imitation, invention, and looking at stylistics through the means of secret strings, and telling the children, if they're young ones, you're poem detectives, and you're going to find stuff that even the writers don't know about. And if it's one of my poems, I say, and even I don't know. And it's a challenge, and it's exciting, and they start finding things. And then we maybe say, well, I wonder whether that's got a name. You found a thing there where someone said, I don't know, let's say, Back to Black. Oh yeah, there we are, thinking of a song. Well, it rhymes. Yeah, that's right, but it's got something else going on there. I wonder whether it's got a name. Yes, it has. So there are these many other grammars, and less obsessed, some of them are, but less obsessed with the idea that writing somehow or other involves what the Victorians were obsessed with, which is classing everything, naming it, and that somehow or other that lays it to rest. I mean, the horror for the Victorians was when Darwin came along and discovered that the rules that they had laid down about nature, about reality, okay, all those rules that had been laid down, and the types and the families and all the rest of it, was in fact rubbish, because it didn't go with the processes he discovered of evolution. So suddenly all the names and classifications went up in the air. Linguistics, it isn't quite like that. Linguistics just goes on and on and on arguing, though to my horror, I find people clinging on to the idea that this grammar believe that somehow or other it is representing the fundamental rules and processes of language. I don't have it. I don't buy it at all. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Michael, for bringing some things together and interspersing them with your talk. So we'll take 4 minutes. Sorry to have fewer than 5 minute breaks, but we'll come back at 5:30. So in about 4 minutes. If you have questions that you'd like to add to the Padlet, feel free. We're still organising that. I'll put the link back in the chat. Have a look through the Padlet though, because there are lots of questions up there already. You can scroll down and you'll see that there's different colours for the different speakers. And if you've got a question that somebody else has asked, just upvote it so you don't need to spend the time typing it. So we'll be back in 3 minutes at 5:30, and then we'll have a 25 minutes Q&A session around the various themes that that are falling out of the questions. Okay, so 3 minutes. We're back at 5:30, and then I'll start up and start directing questions to our panel. Okay, we are back, sorry, someone just put a note in the chat for me, so I'll just have a look. Okay, yeah, so we've got our Padlets here. So thank you very much to all the people listening to the talks for adding so many questions. We've got 25 minutes to cover the Q&A. So what I'm going to suggest that we do is we deal with the general questions and those ones that have been asked most frequently. And we can see those with the upvote icons here. So what I'll do is I'll go around the speakers and put the question that I'm going to ask, that you've asked, to each of the speakers, and to get a short response to that. We'll see how that conversation develops. We'll see how far we get with these questions, and if we do run out of the more general questions, I'll then take the most popular questions that have been posed to each of the individual speakers. So that's how we're going to run this, because we haven't got too long to get through that. I should say that all of the organisers continue to work in this area. These questions are very much the sort of things that they've been grappling with up to now, and certainly will help them think more in the future. So they'll certainly be addressing these questions and thinking about these questions and providing responses to these questions after the event. So thank you very much for adding these to the Padlet. Okay, so I think the most popular question overall, and I think this speaks to, well, I think everybody's talk, I think, if I was paying attention, is this first one up here. So do you think children should be explicitly taught about code switching? So we'll just go in the order that people spoke. So I'll pose that to Emma to start off with, and then we'll come to Debra, and then Michael, and then we might mix the order up as we go on. We'll see how we go. So Emma, what are your thoughts in relation to this question?
I mean, I've been asked before, like, the challenge really that teachers have is this idea that, you know, if you don't have some kind of command of standard English, then you will be disadvantaged in life. And so how do we balance, you know, people like me say, no, let anybody speak how they want, and, you know, everybody should be using their non-standard language, with that real pressure that impacts on people's lives. And I think one of the ways that you deal with that actually is to give children as much knowledge as possible about the way that language works. In all of the ways, I mean, we've all three of us have taught slightly differently about language and how it works, but I think one thing that we all agree on is that people are creative with language. They use language in interesting ways. They use it in ways that tie in not just with who they are, but also what they want to do in an interaction, how they want to talk in an interaction. And that's exactly what I think we should be teaching children, because if children start to realise, you know, they're not just doing a construction that's wrong relative to standard English, what they're actually doing is some really cool bit of language work where they've just used, I know Michael doesn't want me to call it a pronoun, but they've just used a pronoun at the end of a sentence where they use that to show that they were being evaluative, then that's really skillful. So yes, I absolutely think we should be teaching children about all of the ways in which they can switch their language and change language and use different components of it.
Thanks, Emma. Debra?
Yeah, I agree. I think it's about exploring and being curious about the ways in which the different dialectal forms work. Oh, the question's just disappeared, sorry. I think for me, the really key thing though is what are the values or that seem to be suggested by teaching about code switching. So I wouldn't be so pro code switching if it's really effectively saying, well, you talk like this at home, but this is the way you should really talk when you want to talk properly. So it's about teaching code switching in terms of the equal value and the different ways in which they work and where they might not be appropriate. And actually, everybody who speaks a dialect has the right to speak it in the context where standard English is expected if they choose to. So for me, it's about the values that are expressed through that rather than literally whether you teach it or not.
Okay, thanks. Michael, what are your thoughts on whether we should be explicitly teaching about code switching?
Okay, just a clarification. When we're talking about standard English, linguists mean the written form of standard English. I believe 100% it should be taught. In actual fact, we teach it immediately the moment children come into the world and we start reading books to them. Pretty nearly all books that we put in front of children are written in standard English. So we're teaching them that right away. And I believe that's what we do. It is the code in which, you know, all our government administration, newspapers and so on is written. And indeed, a lot of the halfway house writing, that's to say TV news and the like, it's written in script form in standard English and then voiced by presenters like Michael Rosen. So in actual fact, yes, I believe we teach it. Yes, it can be taught explicitly in a variety of ways. We all speak in ways that are divergent from standard English, even the poshest of us. Listen to Boris Johnson. He hesitates, he interrupts himself, he ums and ers, he repeats himself. These are all the forms of speech. So he has a dialect. He has a dialect derived from his background and for the social situations that he moves in. And he probably switches, I don't know, I don't attend to that. But by and large, most of us code switch all the time. How can we teach it? Very easily. You create language maps. So you create a spidergram. I don't know whether you can see me. I'm holding my hand. You put a circle in the middle. You put yourself. Off from there, you put mum, dad, granny, granddad, whatever words you use, uncle, auntie, and you put situations, school, street, any situations that apply to you. And then you, as your individual researcher on your use of language, you then find examples. So how does mum speak? Something typical about mum or dad or granny or granddad. And of course, it might be other languages, it might be all sorts of phrases. And then you start sharing this in a classroom. You can do this, I suggest, with people from about 9 upwards. And I've done it with secondary myself. I've even done a radio program about it. And so you can then suddenly explore, why is this person speaking differently from that person? It may be bi-dialectal, it may be bilingual, it may be why I can shift. Why did my dad, when he wanted to say, I'm in the middle of something, in the middle of a crisis, he didn't say it in English, he always said it in Yiddish, he said in mitten drin. I don't even know whether that's 1 word, 3 words, I don't know what the bits of it are, but he'd just say, Connie, I can't, I'm in mitten drin. And I have that, and I say it. Why do I say it? Because it goes father, son. I can draw that up, that's me code switching. And I can draw it, not by using the language, code switching. I can say, how did my dad speak? What have I nicked from my dad? What did I nick from my mum? She used a different phrase. She'd say, even everything nice, something nice, you could always turn to dreck. It's a lovely, disgusting phrase my mum used. All right. And so I could put that with mum, and I could put something else from my brother. I could put some, and so on. So you can create code switching maps for children quite young, and they will start discussing why and how they do it.
Thanks, Michael. And that's, I think, it sort of moves on to the next question, I think. So I'll direct this to you to start off with, Michael. This is the question here. It's quite a difficult question to answer, but how can we continue to reinforce the message that grammar shouldn't be seen as a way to correct young people, but a way to be creative? But when the government continue to enforce such a restrictive curriculum within schools. So it's a sort of practical question about how we teach that creativity when the curriculum appears to mitigate against it. So, Michael.
So I can only refer to myself really on this. I taught ruthlessly spag grammar to my son for a whole year. That was in his year 6, and he's now 16. So I did precisely as the government asked me to do. And because I'm not a teacher, I realized it's not me that was being evaluated. In fact, it was his teacher. So I thought, well, this is real solidarity with my teacher. I hope she gets a good mark, or whatever it is, this league tables, our Ofsted and assessments and whatever, that somehow or other she would be able to reflect in the glory of my son getting a particular kind of mark in his spag. So I did it ruthlessly, and that's what I did. At the same time, I actually think that a huge amount of it is nonsense and self-contradictory nonsense, as you'll see from the clip if you click on the link where I analyze one of those tests. I'm afraid I can't give you much comfort. I think you have to teach it. You have to teach it because there is the triple pillar of league tables, Ofsted and SATs that are holding you in. Does it do damage? I wouldn't even necessarily say it does. I think it leads to writing by numbers. Whether that leads to permanent psychological damage, I don't know. I doubt it. I think it gives people the wrong idea of what good writing is. I was reading my mum's school magazine from the 1930s, and I noticed they all must have done a hell of a lot of work on noun phrases when they were at Central Foundation School for Girls, because every noun had 3 adjectives in front of it. So I thought, wow, they did their expanded noun phrases to Billy-O at Central Foundation School in 1935, and we're still doing it. And no writer does it, and yet we teach it. And, you know, if you go on to write anything, reports and so on, you'll find that if you start doing that, you know, out there in the real world, they'll just put lines through it and go, well, why did you say that the office was large, gloomy? I don't know, you know, that 5 adjectives in front of it. We just wanted to know whether the office was big enough. So you get all that stuff knocked off you. So in some ways, I'm quite cynical about it. I take my inspiration from The Good Soldier Schweig. If you know that novel, he's somebody who does exactly as he's told. And in fact, authority trips over itself because he's doing as he's told. That's my view of this stuff. Sorry, that's not very helpful and constructive, but I'm telling you what a good, loyal servant to Spag I was with my own son.
Well, thanks for the insight.
Who, incidentally, has forgotten it all, by the way. I mean, I just say that because only yesterday I was looking at his English. He asked me to look at it, and I said, "Well, you could use a fronted adverbial there." And he went, "Huh." Sorry, that's.
So it perhaps doesn't do permanent psychological damage then. Debra, what are your thoughts?
It's a question that I'm asked a lot when I'm working with teachers. And I think, first of all, you can't underestimate the power of that high stakes accountability assessment. So I don't want to say anything that's sort of ridiculously positive and naive in context. But what I do say a lot is try to keep the SPAG test in proportion. It's a ridiculous test. What it tests is not what it purports to test anyway, but actually all the evidence is children find the test itself relatively easy, because the way they construct the questions is that most of the answers are mind-blowingly obvious, which kind of undermines its purpose. So we don't need to spend as much time as currently happens in school continuously drilling children for the test. So I would say teach the grammar the way that I've been talking about, you know, in a context, not prescriptively, but descriptively. Empower children to be curious about the way the grammar is working, not just doing exercises. The other problem with a lot of well, it's already happening, that kind of preparing them for the test, you know, virtually from the beginning of Key Stage 2, just is so dull for them. And they get so fed up with it and so bored with it. And that can never be good. So my big advice would be keep the test in perspective.
Thanks, Debra. I think there's a comment in the chat that's coming as I think as Michael was talking about the way in which grammar being used is leading to boredom. So that sort of reflects back what you were saying. Emma, your thoughts?
Yeah, I think like other people have said, I think, you know, it's policy and there isn't much we can do about it, but we can make decisions about in the way Debra talked about in what else we teach and how we contextualize what we're teaching. I think I'm probably a bit more cynical in that I think perhaps damage is done a little bit with this type of teaching, in this particularly for children who speak in different ways at home to the way that might be being modelled to them in the school system. I think you can't help but internalise the fact that what you're doing is different, and actually therefore that means something about you personally, when of course it doesn't. It just means something about the ideologies around language and the values that are assigned to random bits of language that come through not systematic routes. So yeah, I suppose the way I again, as I said, I think in my response to the first question is, I think the need is to continue to make people aware about language variation, about the fact that there are ideologies that assign values to certain parts of language. Because I think if you know that there's a system out there that's assigning value to language, you can then see how you feel about language is not a personal thing, it's actually systematic. And I think that's really important. I think if you start to feel that there's something wrong with you and the way that you speak, rather than there's a system that tells people their language is valued in different ways, it's quite empowering, because it stops being about you and about a more general problem with the way that language is evaluated in the world.
Thanks, Emma. Some of the, I think some of the more general questions tend to have been asked by slightly fewer people, and then there's a greater number of questions for the talks in particular. So I wonder if we could turn to you, Deborah, with this question here, which is the most asked. How can we provide children with choices in how they use grammar, language, etc., if schools police grammar and penalise children who are culturally and linguistically diverse? It's similar to the previous question.
Yeah, I guess it has a slight overlap with my answer to the spelling test one. And I think I would say from the start, I don't think schools should be policing grammar and penalising children who are culturally, linguistically diverse. And I know lots and lots of English teachers in primary schools who work enormously hard to avoid doing just that. So in a way, that's more about how the ideologies of schools and, linguistically diverse classrooms have so many brilliant teachers who are constantly drawing attention to what the children bring into the classroom. In terms of choices in how they use grammar and language, what we're really looking at is trying to get away from the idea that there is a single right way to do something. Not so much about rules, but more that the kind of feeling or the way things are being done at the moment, where children are being taught that if you want to write well, you need to put in one of these and have a little smattering of 2 or 3 of those, and then make sure you get in one of those. And that is taking away all choice, because it's simply saying that this is the way that you write. So we're much more interested in getting away from that way of thinking about it to thinking about what could you do? How is this working? Talk to me, justify your choices. And that for me is opening up children's understanding rather than just creating compliance.
Thanks, Deborah. So I'll come to Emma, and then I'm just selecting a frequently asked question for after this. But the most asked question for you was this one up at the top left, Emma. So, as a Northerner from working class background, I really enjoyed your talk. Thank you. Have you found the use of the double pronouns is more commonly found in specific regions, particularly across Northern England, or would you say they're used quite equally over the UK? So are they regionally restricted or used more broadly?
The data seems to suggest that they are regionally restricted to some extent, so they do seem to be more frequent in northern dialects. But I don't know how much of that is also a consequence of the research being done on those particular dialects over other dialects. One thing that is clear is that they are certainly the personal pronoun ones, so the ones that aren't the full noun phrase at the end, they are used much less frequently wherever these types are found, but actually the noun phrase ones are found everywhere. So they're talked about in grammars of English. They are mentioned as things that happen, but I mean, I think more importantly is this sense that whatever you want to call them, these things are like really interesting bits of language that do specific types of social work, and some of that social work might be tied to things like ways of talking or ways of expressing that are more strongly linked to Northerners, for instance, than Southerners. So we all see the stereotype, and it's used in marketing and in advertisements, of the blunt, straight talking Northerner. And that sort of ties in again with how we might think about this, not just as something that's a feature of language, but actually is doing really important social work that ties up both with what happens in the conversation, but also what happens in terms of a person's identity and who they're trying to present themselves as.
Okay, thanks, Emma. So we've got one of them. Something that's caused a bit of debate, Michael, is a question here in terms of. So here's the question: without teaching the explicit grammar of standard written English, how can we ensure that reticent readers and students from language-poor homes develop the same command of style in their writing? As you say, you don't think about what you're doing when you write, but you are drawing on and imitating patterns from your wider reading that many less advanced students will not have access to. And somebody found the dislike button for this. So we've got 3 upvotes and 1 downvote. So
okay, look, as I say, the grammar that is being taught and the grammar we keep referring to, apart from when we put on another hat and talk about Hallidaean grammar and other grammars like Delheim's construction grammar and so on, genre grammar, pragmatics and so on. We're simply talking about the grammar of a written form, and it's only one written form. It's not TV scripts, it's not songs, okay? So it's the grammar of one written form, standard English, as you find in novels, non-fiction, newspapers, that sort of thing. First of all, it evolves, it's not fixed. So you now have the word don't that appears in newspapers. That was absolutely verboten when I was a kid. You always had to write do not, and I am, never I'm. So we're talking about one very specific thing. I believe it should be taught. I believe it can be taught. There's a variety of ways of teaching it. You can use sentence grammar. I think it will have limited results as evidenced by 20, 30 years of O-level exams, unless you find other ways to do it. But so long as you keep in mind and you're open, particularly with teenagers, I think slightly different with primary kids, but with teenagers, you're totally open with the fact that this is about a specific form of writing that we think is valuable and will be examined, and it is this form of language. There are many other forms and there are many other grammars. So we're teaching this particular kind of grammar for this particular form of standard English, a form of language which we call standard English. And there may actually be other ways of teaching that without necessarily using this grammar. I gave one example. If you take a category like time aspect instead of tense, or you take a category like cohesion instead of simply saying pronouns, and you separate that off from this and that and various other aspects of cohesion, that you may find that you have more powerful tools. So toolbox, fine, let's stick with the metaphor. You have more powerful tools in your toolbox than that given to you by this Latinate grammar that demands that you talk about tense, infinitives, pronouns, gerunds, and that sort of stuff. You may find that you have actually some better tools to use. And I'm suggesting to you that stylistics, looking at the stylistics of standard English, what strategies does it use? So for example, David Crystal draws attention to the fact that when we speak, we tend not to bung up stuff at the beginning of the sentence, okay, in front of the main clause, okay, all very technical. So we do a lot of fronting when we write, but when we speak, we tend not to. We begin, as Halliday says, with the subject in all its senses and then add on stuff later. That central feature of a difference between spoken and written language is a crucial part, and you draw attention to that with school students, and then I think you're cooking on all four burners, rather than necessarily saying, oh, well, you know, that you haven't necessarily made this agree with that and so on. And remember, all of us who write, you know what we do, don't you? We just hand it to editors. So this whole idea that writers are somehow people who kind of can really get the nitty gritty of their own editing, not a bit of it. You should see our manuscripts that we hand over to editors who then go through it and decide that, you know, we can't use or we can use the Oxford comma, and that, you know, you should or shouldn't have a comma after a fronted adverbial, all this stuff. They do it. And of course, by the way, punctuation isn't grammar, but anyway, let's not go there. So, you know, yes, I believe it should be taught. Yes, there will be some limited value in teaching the sentence grammar that we've been talking about, called grammar that describes language. I disagree with that formulation. And I think there are many other ways. And I think stylistics is the richest.
Okay, thanks for that. Yeah, there's some discussion in the chat about terminology in the question itself, which perhaps led to the controversy about it. I think a question that occurs to me after the talks is the extent to which the standard English is privileged in assessment, and what that and how we embed this understanding that these that this is one variety amongst many, and that this is something that you perhaps need to learn, but is equally valid, and how that and how we really communicate that to students when there's so much and students and teachers when there's so much pressure on them to conform to this very narrow understanding of grammar, and how do we foster that love and appreciation of variety in language, which does seem somewhat at odds with the the narrow understanding of grammar. I don't know if Emma, do you want to try and respond to that poorly formed question from me?
As you were talking, I was sort of thinking about how what we do when we teach standard English is that certainly what the national curriculum proposes that we do when we teach standard English is to suggest that it's an alternative way of using non-standard language. So it's always sort of placed as something that is sort of you can substitute non-standard language for. So instead of just stating it the way that you say it in non-standard English, you can just use this standard English form, which is an equivalent. And I think fundamentally that's one of the biggest problems with the way that we talk about language variation, because non-standard English is not a direct equivalent from standard English. They've got, you might use you might use a particular form to reference a similar idea, and you can say how you reference that idea in standard English, but non-standard English is also doing a ton of other things as well, like showing that you're happy or sad, or that you're compassionate or friendly or agreeable. And that just gets completely lost in this idea that, well, all we're trying to teach you to do is substitute the way you speak with this other way of speaking. And I'm saying speaking quite deliberately, because although we are, I agree with Michael. I don't think, and we have to teach written English. There has to be a written standard, otherwise there's no way to systematise communication. But it leaks into speech because of the way that it's presented in the curriculum and in society generally. So I think finding ways to talk about language variation and different varieties of language without talking about them as two opposing systems that just do the same thing in different ways, I think is really useful. And actually Julia is probably the one to talk about this in terms of her idea of we shouldn't be talking about standard English and non-standard English as two dialect systems. What we should be talking about is the repertoires that people have that actually combine both non-standard and standard accent features. I might stop talking. Do you want to say anything, Julia? Or I'm putting you on the spot, but
sorry, I wasn't prepared to speak, but yeah, just to echo that, I think it's a lot of these questions, or some of the questions, are touching on this idea of well, how do we teach standard English without kind of devaluing non-standard forms? How do we focus on kind of the stuff we have to do for standardized testing? And I think within all of this, we get these kind of binaries, and the standard non-standard binary is one of those that kind of reinforces some of the kind of value judgments that Debra talked about. And we as linguists do it all the time as well. And every time we talk about a standard versus a non-standard form, we're reifying those distinctions. And actually, or when we talk about code switching, we're talking about code switching between standard English and a non-standard variety. But actually, there's no one, as Michael pointed out there, who speaks standard English. There's a written standard English, but nobody speaks that. Equally, there's no one who speaks kind of, Leeds dialect in its kind of bounded entirety. There are language users who make all of these kinds of choices, and the choices they make are using forms that are associated with standard English, using forms that are associated with local dialect, and a whole other kind of repertoire. Michael talked about some of the kind of features that his father used. He wasn't even sure what it means, but now he uses it as part of his repertoire. So there's this whole repertoire of language features, and it's really useful and productive to think about it in terms of repertoire, instead of kind of reinforcing that binary between standard and non-standard, because that leads to lots of other binaries like formal versus informal that I think both Emma and Michael talked about as being a really reductive way of thinking about language variation. But I'll leave it there.
This also goes back to the thing Michael talked about when he said, he asked kids, they put the kid in the middle, and then there's all the different branches coming off. That's kind of what you're talking about as well, Julia, is the idea that there's me, and then there's all these things that are part of my repertoire, but they're not, I'm not necessarily just in one system of language to do that.
Right. And it's not that, again, with the problem with code switching, and Deborah highlighted this as well, is that if we give children the idea that there's one variety that they must use in school and in other important, powerful, formal contexts, and their variety is just to be used on the street, in the playgrounds, at home, then obviously we are kind of reinforcing value judgments. But if you think about a repertoire, you know, even within a formal situation like a presentation or an interview or talking in the classroom, you're going to be using features that are associated with standard English, and you're going to be using features that are associated with dialect and all kinds of other different varieties as well. So there isn't kind of a neat, well, this is the language variety we use in this situation, this is the one we use in this situation necessarily. There's, you know, there's kind of a more or less in terms of the language features. But yeah, that's perhaps another way, and we can kind of break down this idea that there's just this kind of, there are these different varieties that match different situations that inevitably leads to kind of the hierarchies in language as well.
Thanks, Julia, and thanks, Emma. So it is now 6 o'clock, so we are going to draw the event to a close. Thank you to all the speakers. Thank you to Emma, to Michael, and to Deborah. Thanks, Julia, for giving your impromptu answer. Thanks to everybody who's attended the event and put so many great questions onto the Padlet, and who've started a decent chat thread as well around the answers to some of the questions. So thank you everybody for attending. As I said at the start of the event, there is a recording that will be emailed to you, as well as an evaluation link, so you can tell us what you thought of the session. So that is it. So thank you everybody for attending. Thanks again to the speakers, and you'll hear from Emma in due course with the recording link and the evaluation link. Thank you very much.